Welcome to Chapter 26. This will be a series of 3 lectures over fluid, electrolytes, and acid-base balance. And you're probably wondering, why do I have to know that, Dr. Cohn? And it's because this is the way your body works. So this is why you need to know about electrolytes, acid-base balance, and fluids. So let's go ahead and get started. So in your body, there are 3 fluid compartments. Our body water content is really based about how much fat we have, skeletal muscle, etc. Because adipose tissue, it carries the least amount of water. That makes a lot of sense since, fats and water don't mix. So when we look at our total amount of water in an average adult. So if your patient is a large person, tall, with little body fat, then you're going to see they're going to have a little bit more water. If they're short, a little bit less. The more body fat there is, the less water. But when we look at total body water, we're looking at about 40 liters. 40 liters. So you stop and think about, okay, that is 22-liter bottles of Dr. Pepper. That's wow, that's pretty cool. And as we get older, then our amount of water decreases, usually because loss of skeletal muscle and a higher fat content. There are 2 main fluid compartments. What's inside the cell and what's outside the cell. Intracellular, ICF, intracellular is the fluid inside the cells. And extracellular, ECF, extracellular, is divided into the plasma and the interstitial fluid. Now notice that the plasma carries the least amount of water. The interstitial fluid, so this is in the space between cells, carries about 12 liters of water. Please note these abbreviations: ICF for intracellular, ECF for extracellular, plasma, and then interstitial, in between the cells or in the tissue, is called IF. IF. So this is a nice picture that helps you visualize that most of the water is going to be inside the cells, okay? And then followed by interstitial fluid, and the least amount of water is going to be in the plasma. So what is the composition of our body fluids? Well, of course, water. And we remember from freshman chemistry that water is the universal solvent, and that solutes are the things that are dissolved in water. Solutes can be basically classified as electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Okay? Non-electrolytes are going to be organic molecules that do not dissociate in water. So there are no charged particles. That's important. Make sure you write this down in your notes. There are no charged particles with non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are going to be things like inorganic salts, acid bases, a few proteins. These dissociate into ions in water. That's very important. They dissociate into ions in water. So remember that our ions are used to create our electrical gradient. That is important for our heart to work and important for our nervous system to work properly. Because ions dissociate in water, then they have a greater osmotic power. And this is because something that doesn't dissociate is just one particle, okay? Whereas something like salt, sodium chloride, will dissociate into two molecules, so it's two particles. Magnesium chloride dissociates into three particles. You stop and think about this. This means that the more particles that you have, then the more influence the molecule has over fluid shift in the compartments. Let's look at electrolytes. Electrolytes are going to be expressed in milliequivalents per liter. Milliequivalents per liter. And this is how we're going to measure electrical charge of a liter of solution. So here you have your happy little mathematical equation. And one thing I want to point out to you in this is it's multiplied by the number of electric charges on one ion. So sodium has a single charge. Therefore, it's considered to be 1 milliequivalent, which is the same as 1 milliosmol. Okay? 1 milliequivalent, the same as 1 milliosmol. Let me erase my boo-boo there. There we go. Let's try again. All right. 1 milliequivalent is equal to 1 milliosmol. But for ions that have a +2 charge, then we divide that by half. Okay? So that 1 milliequivalent of calcium is 1/2 or 0.5 milliosmoles. So 1 milliequivalent of either provides the same amount of charge. The same amount of charge. So 1 milliequivalent equals 1 milliosmol. 1 milliequivalent equals the same amount of charge. You need to kind of draw a line, and let's talk about the composition of body fluids. Remember that there are three compartments of body fluids. We have the plasma, the interstitial fluid, and the intracellular fluid. In each compartment, the extracellular and the intracellular has a very distinctive pattern of electrolytes. And you should remember this from our study of the nervous system and our study of the cardiovascular system, how the heart works. So the extracellular fluid is going to have the major cation of sodium and the major anion of chloride. All right? The intracellular fluid is going to contain more soluble proteins than the plasma does. We remember its major cation is potassium and its major anion is bicarbonate. And you should remember that the way we get an electrical current is to flip-flop the concentration of sodium and potassium. That's how we get a membrane potential. If you don't remember that, then go back and review it quickly. It'll come back to you. So when we look at this, we know electrolytes are the most abundant solutes, and the bulk of the dissolved solutes, in other words, what takes up the most space, is protein, phospholipids, cholesterol, and triglycerides. All right? So the most abundant, the largest number, are going to be electrolytes, but the bulk take up the most space. Proteins, phospholipids, cholesterol, and triglycerides. That makes sense because those are going to be very large molecules, where electrolytes are very small molecules. This is an excellent chart showing you what's in the blood plasma, the interstitial fluid, and the intracellular fluid. And when you look at this, you look at the blood plasma is red, the interstitial fluid is blue, and the intracellular fluid is yellow. Where is the majority of the sodium? It's in the extracellular fluid. Where's the majority of the potassium? It's in the intracellular fluid. What do you notice about calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, chloride, phosphate, sulfate, and proteins? Take a good look and note intracellular, the highest potassium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate, and proteins. Make sure that you look at that and you understand the balance in the body. I'm not going to ask you to know values in milliequivalents. I just want you to be able to tell me that sodium is found mainly in the extracellular fluid, potassium is found mainly in the intracellular fluid, calcium, extracellular, magnesium, intracellular, etc. So how does fluid move in between these compartments? Well, water is going to move freely along its osmotic gradient. Hydrostatic pressure is going to, osmotic and hydrostatic pressure are going to regulate the exchange and mixing of fluids, so that all body fluid osmolality is almost always equal. And so what we're talking about is isotonic conditions. So when we look at what happens if there's an increase in extracellular fluid solute concentration, in other words, its osmolality increases, then water will leave the cell and go into the extracellular fluid. If extracellular fluid osmolality decreases, then water will enter the cell. This is all about freshman biology, hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic. So when we look at exchange between plasma and IF, interstitial fluids, that happens along the capillary walls. We've already talked about this. Exchange between interstitial fluid and intracellular fluid occurs across the cell membrane. You talked about that endlessly in freshman biology first semester. Okay, so I think what's important to note here is that nutrients, wastes, and gases have a unidirectional flow. All right, water flows two ways. Ions can move selectively in and out, but nutrients, waste, and gases flow in one direction. So when we look at this picture, we see that O2 flows out of the lungs, right, into the blood plasma, to the interstitial fluid, and inside the cell. That's the direction it flows. CO2 flows out of the cell into the blood plasma and eventually into the lung tissue to be exhaled. Look at nutrients. They flow from the stomach to the blood, to the interstitial fluid, to the cells. Water is going to, and ions are going to flow both directions. Even in the kidneys, water and ions flow in both directions. But notice that the nitrogenous wastes flow out of the cell into the interstitial fluid, into the blood plasma to be filtered by the kidneys and are peed out in your urine. When we look at water balance and the extracellular fluid osmolality, we have to understand that we need to take in as much water as we lose per day. And so, we're talking about drinking beverages, what food, and then metabolic water, or the water of oxidation. Remember that when ATP is made, that oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and it takes up the used electrons, it takes up the protons, and we get water. We get metabolic water. How do we lose water? Well, mainly by urinating. And then we have what's called insensible water loss, which is basically what we breathe out, what is going to evaporate from our skin, our perspiration, and in feces. So how does the body maintain osmolality? Well, basically what happens is that if the extracellular fluid becomes too concentrated, in other words, there's a rise in osmolality, then our brain senses that in the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the thirst reflex. And it also causes ADH, antidiuretic hormone, to be released. If there's a decrease in osmolality, then you don't feel thirsty, and ADH is inhibited. So what we find is that in our water intake and output, if you look at how much fluid we take in, most of it's going to be in some kind of beverage. All right? How do we lose fluid? Most of that is going to be lost by urine. So what's going to drive us to take in water? The thirst mechanism. And this is in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has osmoreceptors, and they're constantly monitoring the extracellular fluid osmolality. And if there's an increase in plasma osmolality of 1 to 2%, you start thinking about it. That's not very much. Then your mouth gets dry, and you say, "Oh, I'm thirsty," and hopefully you get water. They is also going to be triggered by a decrease in blood volume or blood pressure, and angiotensin 2 or baroreceptor input will also increase the thirst center. And talking a lot also increases your thirst. So the hypothalamic thirst center is what's going to regulate whether or not we feel thirsty. What does drinking water do? It inhibits the thirst system. In fact, if you just rinse out your mouth with water, spit out the water, don't swallow it, that relief of the dry mouth will tell the hypothalamus, "Yay, we have water!" Now the hypothalamus is not going to be fooled for very long, because it also reads activation of the stomach and the intestinal stretch receptors to see if you actually swallowed what you just took in your mouth. So figure 26.5 we look at here, and we see what are the two things that trigger the thirst reaction in the hypothalamus. An increase in extracellular osmolality and a decrease in plasma volume. Decrease in plasma volume means a decrease in blood pressure, and that is going to do two things. It's going to trigger the hypothalamus thirst center, and it's going to activate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So read through this and understand the mechanism of why when you get thirsty, your brain takes over. If you want, you can stretch, take a break. So how does our body regulate losing water? We have obligatory water loss. So this is the insensible water loss from the lungs or the skin. And then sensible water loss from urinating. It could be due to diarrhea, sweating, and then just regular feces. But remember, regular feces is very, very small percent. So how much you pee depends on how much fluid you take in, your diet, and water loss via other avenues. So you know as well as I do that if you take in too much ethanol, you're going to pee and pee and pee and pee. Caffeine is going to stimulate your need to urinate. If you eat something that's really salty, your body says, eek, drink water. So, you sit down and eat a whole bag of chips, you're going to need to drink a lot of water with that. What's mainly in chips? Sodium chloride. All right. So, what does ADH do? Antidiuretic hormone. We looked at this briefly in chapter 16 when we talked about the endocrine system. But mainly what we're going to look at here, ADH, water reabsorption in the collecting ducts, okay, is proportional to ADH release. We also studied this in the previous chapter, chapter 25, when we looked at how urine is made. So if there's a decreased ADH, so this gives us dilute urine and a drop in the volume of body fluids. Decrease ADH, dilute urine, you pee more. If you pee more, then the volume of fluids is going to decrease. This is why people who have problems with retaining water take an antidiuretic drug, okay, like Lasix, because it makes them pee more. Why does it make them pee more? Because it affects the collecting ducts. All right, what about increased ADH? This leads to concentration of urine. So, Lasix is a diuretic drug, not an antidiuretic drug. Lasix is a diuretic drug. It makes you pee more. Increase ADH, then you're going to concentrate the urine because antidiuresis means reabsorption of water. This causes an increase in body fluids. So, decrease ADH, dilute urine, you get rid of more fluid. Lasix is a diuretic drug that is going to lead to increased urination. Increased ADH leads to concentrated urine, okay, because more water is being reabsorbed into the blood system, and that increases the volume of body fluids. What's going to trigger this is the hypothalamic osmoreceptors. okay? The hypothalamic osmoreceptors. Other things that can trigger ADH is a large change in blood volume or pressure, okay? This is due to baroreceptors and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. And then decreased blood pressure volume is, decreased blood pressure volume is caused by intense sweating. So when Dalton's out there playing tennis in the heat, or Ramsey's playing softball in the heat, or Elizabeth is playing golf, you know, you stop and think, you're out in the heat and you're sweating. And so that can decrease your volume, and if it decreases your volume, it decreases your blood pressure. Also vomiting, diarrhea, severe blood loss, hemorrhaging, traumatic burns because you lose your protection of your skin and you just evaporate basically. And then prolonged fever, high temperature for a long period of time. Figure 26.6 is going to review the mechanism on how we get decreased urine volume, increased plasma volume, how antidiuretic hormone is triggered, and what takes place. Please look at this and study it so that you understand the mechanism. Okay, we're coming toward the end of our lecture. So what are the disorders? So 3 problems. Dehydration. This could be caused by excessive sweating, hemorrhaging, burns, vomiting, diarrhea, water deprivation, people who take diuretic drugs to control their weight, and then some endocrine diseases. What we see is an oral mucosa that is very white and dry. People are thirsty, their skin is dry and reddish, and they have oliguria. Urea, urine, O-L-I-G, it means scant, so they ain't got much pee. This can lead to weight loss, which is why some people abuse diuretic drugs. Fever, mental confusion, hypovolemic shock, loss of electrolytes. It could lead, long enough, it can lead to death. Children and elderly are very susceptible to rapid dehydration. So we have to stop and think about how to take care of the very young and the very old. So this is looking at dehydration. And basically what happens is the cells are going to lose water to the extracellular fluid, and that that can be given off. And in this picture they're showing someone who's really sweating out in the Sonoran Desert. Why? I don't know. Hypotonic hydration. Hypotonic hydration. So the cells are overhydrated. This is often called water intoxication. It can happen when the kidneys aren't working properly, or if someone is rapidly taking in excessive water. You may have seen something similar to this when people take in alcoholic beverages too fast, and it causes everything to be out of balance. But what happens is the extracellular fluid osmolality decreases. That causes hyponatremia. In other words, not enough sodium. The cells will swell. You stop thinking about it, the cells will swell. What happens when a cell swells, that's hard to say, beyond its membrane's ability to stay in one piece, those cells are going to explode and die. We see severe metabolic disturbances, nausea, vomiting, muscle cramping, cerebral edema, and it can cause death. So basically, notice here in hypotonic hydration, someone drinking too much water, then the water moves into the cell will swell up, and it can cause cellular death. The last disorder is edema, and this is tissue swelling. So the cell is not swelling the tissue. So there's interstitial fluid increasing. We see this, that increased fluid flow out of the blood, decreased return of fluid to the blood, an inflammatory response, and so tissue swelling, not the cells, that is hypotonic hydration. Tissues, edema. This brings us to the end of our lecture.